My name is Rebecca Casey, and I will be doing my presentation on cognitive and language development, stages of child and adolescent development. So cognitive and language development and the stages of child and adolescent development in particular, we're looking at Paiget, and so I will be doing an introduction and then of what my presentation will be about. And then I will be looking at Paiget's 4 stages of development in detail. I will be looking at some criticisms of Paiget, and these are criticisms that more expand on the research he did instead of debunk the research that he did, which is important to keep building on what we already know. And then I'll be looking at Erikson's stages of development to give some more context and refinement to what Paiget was doing. So there'll be Erikson in majority, a little bit of Freudianism, and then of course the Paiget's 4 stages contrasted so we can see a fuller picture of how children into adulthood develops over time. And then I will have a conclusion, and then at the end I will have resources if you want to follow up and do additional research on your own. So introduction. So as educators, we're kind of keenly interested in child development, especially in the case of the pandemic, right after, following after the pandemic, there's been a little bit of arrested development to where we're seeing students return back to the school, but they're not progressing the way we're used to it. I wouldn't say it's normal because I think they're doing a great job of coping, considering the trauma that they've been through. So I wouldn't say necessarily they're not developing normally or in a healthy way. I would just say that it's different from the norm of what we're used to, but I would still say it's a normal adaptation. So I think we're keenly aware of child development right now and how do we approach it. Given the situation we're in now, which is why I think the fuller context will really make sense. And then there's some points that the criticisms bring out about how we as educators can take what Paiget has given us and apply it to our field of education. So instead of trying to look at the child as a whole, really bring that into our area of discipline and what we're teaching and look for skills development and knowledge development, which would be more in line with what Paiget was aiming at. So I found that was very, very helpful. So hopefully you enjoyed that as well. So these are Paiget's 4 stages of development. So what I'm looking at is a snapshot and overview of what his 4 stages of development are. I highly recommend anybody who's going to fall into a camp of a theorist that you do the research to find out what were they researching, their initial question, the method that they used, the data collection they used, how they cleaned up their data, what they presented in their data, and then what answers they were able to flesh out, any questions that were left unanswered, and kind of follow that through. Because otherwise we wind up getting into very trendy, superficial applications of some very complex. I found Paiget was very complex, and so I'll be following up on it later. But when you don't have that complexity and you don't have the context of what a researcher is doing, then when you try to apply what they're doing, I find that it doesn't work out necessarily as well. So I found Paiget to be very interesting, as well as the other people who kind of addressed what he studied, as well as other child or human development specialists. So I tried to give a kind of full picture of that. And I have included links for anybody who wants to do further research on what I researched. So hopefully that helps flesh this out a little bit. So stage 1 is the sensory motor period. So that's birth to 2 years old. And so youth at this time during stage 1, as you can see from the chart, they experience the world through vision. They experience the world through motor, so through movement and touching. So they really use their senses to kind of experience the world. There are 6 substages that Paiget kind of outlined, and I will discuss that on the next slide after this slide. Stage 2 is the pre-operational stage. So those are stages 2 through 7 years. So you're looking at PK. As far as an educator, we're looking at pre-K, kindergarten, first, maybe second grade, depending on the student. And so these are the semiotic function stage, which I will discuss a little bit more in detail on a future slide. A child can assimilate knowledge, so they start to not just take in knowledge, but start to assimilate and bring it all together to kind of make sense of their world. And there's 5 characteristics that, again, Paiget outlines that are discussed in a future slide. So it'll be next 2 slides will be stage 1 and stage 2, kind of in more detail, because I found these are the foundational years, and so we can kind of make a lot of sense out of youth development by understanding stage 1 and stage 2. So I personally have taught at university, and then I just finished teaching 8th grade for 2 years, and now I'm moving back into high school, so I'm moving kind of back up towards where I originally started off. But understanding stage 1 and stage 2 was incredibly helpful for me teaching in middle school, and I feel like it's really going to be helpful teaching in high school, especially given the pandemic. I've noticed a lot of students have arrested development, so they haven't necessarily moved through the stages 1, 2, 3, and 4 the way they're lined out by philosophers and psychologists, because our systems that we have put in place have kind of fallen apart. Or have been put on pause. And so I noticed a lot of students have had a prolonged childhood. Now I know that actually will give them deeper neural pathways the longer that they remain in childhood. There's research that says that actually is beneficial. But then how do we help them start to regain that momentum towards career and college and career readiness is kind of one of the big questions in secondary. For anybody who's like primary, that's our big question, is how do we get them back on track, make sure they develop so that they're ready to enter either post-secondary education or the workforce when they graduate. So seeing that kind of retreat back to childhood has been kind of interesting. I don't think it's necessarily bad. I know a lot of people are panicking over it, but I feel like it's very healthy for students to have found a way for them to deal with the trauma of the pandemic. So all that to say, for me, looking at Paiget and when he says stage 1 and stage 2, though I was aware of it superficially, it's kind of really gave me a chance to do a lot of reflection on what I've seen in middle school and what I anticipate in high school as well. So stage 3 would be the concrete operational stage, so 7 to 11 years old. So those would be later elementary to maybe the first year of middle school, first year of secondary. So the termination of an egocentric attitude, so they put away that it's all about me, which is very, very healthy when you're young, to kind of learning to be a part of the society, their friends group, the school, playing in organized sports and everything like that. So that would be in stage 3, according to Paiget. Learning to apply logical rules to concrete objects. So for example, if you have water and you know it's a certain measurement, if you change containers, so from a glass, say, to a vase, the shape of the water may change, but a student or a child at this age would be able to understand that it is still the same amount of water. Mentally transform, modify, or manipulate what they see or hear, so they can take things in and not just work with it verbatim or literally, but they can start making those leaps into figurative language. In math, that would be more abstract mathematical skills, still working though with the concrete. And then stage 4 would be formal operations, so the final stage, 12 to adulthood. So at this stage, a child would learn to, or later on adults, would learn to apply logical rules to abstract ideas. So they're not taking everything literally, but they can apply the rules of logic to abstract concepts like theory, math. So then you get into those higher math and the higher English literature skills. That would apply in history, so it's not learn history, just taking in knowledge, but starting to think about what would we do with that knowledge, how do we apply it. Same would happen with science, to try to start projecting what we know scientifically, so maybe working with stats at a smaller level. Analyzing the environment, so that would be one of the things that we would see in formal operations, and moving beyond concrete facts, what is, to problem solving what could be. So these are all the markers, and these are just those very superficial snapshot, just an overview that Paiget outlined for us as 4 stages of development for humans. So this is stage 1 a little bit closer. So I'm going to try to drill down into a little more detail because I found stage 1 and stage 2 were very dense, which kind of makes sense. You're setting up for the rest of your development going forward. Again, you'll see that echoed in Freud and Erikson. So stage 1 includes inborn motor and sensory reflexes like sucking and palmar reflexes. So this is a very reflexatorial stage. So this would be stage 1 development, but stage 1 of stage 1. And that's how it's put in the literature, so that's how I'm putting it here. Stage 2 would be primary circular reaction. So the infant experiences an event and then attempts to repeat the action. So that's whenever you see people smile at the baby and the baby mirrors that. So it's very mimetic. On into repeating sounds, you go ba ba ba, and the baby goes ba ba ba. Stage 3, secondary circular in reaction. So the infant repeats an action with specific desired consequence or achieves an unrelated consequence. So this is when they start to experiment with, they say ba 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 and maybe you'll say it back, or they smile and maybe you'll smile back. Stage 4 of stage 1 uses familiar means to obtain ends. So this is deliberately planning of steps to meet a goal or objective. So you might see this with babies trying to manipulate their toys, trying to roll over, crawl, doing things like that, right? So they're trying to actually interact with their world more proactively. Stage 5, tertiary circular reaction. Experiment with their environment. So this is where an infant will start to experiment with their environment, use a property of one object to manipulate another. So this is maybe when they start trying to feed themselves, moving things around, using a rattle, right, as something to move stuff around. So it's not just rattling it, but using it for other purposes. And then stage 6 would be insight. The child imitates manipulation of the environment to enact his own desire on the environment. So that would be that final stage of stage 1. And so this is all, you can see the source at the bottom, the National Library of Medicine, where they were breaking down Paiget's research and kind of making it more condensed. So it's like a summary. So here we have stage 2. It's a closer look at the 5 behaviors in stage 2 as outlined by Paiget. So behavior number 1 is imitation. So the child models observational behavior, observed behavior even after the disappearance of the thing the child is imitating. So you may see a baby start to do things that their parents did, even when the parents aren't there anymore, or if they have a favorite show, they might continue to imitate that. Behavior 2 would be symbolic play. So that's make-believe or play-pretend behavior. It's characterized by the child's ability to project an idea onto an object symbolically. Like, so this is my baby with a doll would be one thing. Or, the superhero where they're kind of playing with a make-believe superhero doll and using that as they see themselves in that. So it's symbolizing, the fantasies that they have in their head. So that's that make-believe. Behavior number 3 is drawing. So begins early in the pre-operational period and incorporates both play and imitation. So drawing very much is about learning through play. And that's one of the things that Derrida talks about, that you can be as serious as playing because you can learn a lot by playing, because that's originally how we interact with and learn about our world. So I found that was very informative here. That playing kind of drawing incorporates both playtime and imitation as a way to kind of learn and explore what your inner world is and your outer world, kind of bringing those together. Behavior number 4 was mental image. The child persistently asks adults to name or identify objects so that the child can associate the name of the object with the mental image of the object. So a lot of times kids ask a lot of questions. So what they're doing is they're looking to a trusted adult to give them information so they can continue to build their database. And you may find this a lot when you're teaching. Even when you're teaching at university, as soon as students are introduced to new information, they start whipping out, asking a lot of questions. What do you call that? Can you repeat that? That's a really good sign that it's not that the students are not paying attention, but that really means they are paying attention, because they're trying to weed through and kind of line up what they've just learned with what they learned before and kind of assign an appropriate signifier or word to it. So I think that's pretty cool to have learned that that starts happening at this age. And behavior number 5 is verbal evocation of events. So the culmination of symbiotic function is the child's use of language to imitate and reflect events that occurred in the child's past. So that's where that semiotics comes into play. So this is when they're first taking their first steps to do verbal evocation of events that have happened before. So kind of expressing and creating their own history, so to speak. So here are some objections and criticisms. And like I said before, this is more refining what Paiget did, and not to criticize as to debunk it, but saying this is the areas where they see more research could be done. So Eric Lunzer, and I do have resources for this in the back if you want to read up on the full thing, because this is these like 40-50 page long research that was done. So I'm just taking from the conclusion the snippets that I felt were really kind of telling for us as educators. So Eric Lunzer says, in spite of the recognition of a more or less clear-cut distinction between concrete and formal reasoning, the transition from one to the other requires more elucidation. So it needs to be kind of fleshed out when we're saying we're going from concrete thinking to formal reasoning, or concrete reasoning to formal reasoning. What exactly do we mean by that? Can we make clearer definitions for that so we can actually measure it better? How far are problems from the analogy variety made easier by preparation for standardized tests? So one of the things that he talked about was with the type of testing that Paiget used, and he's like about 20 or 30 years after Paget's original research. Can we look at the preparation for tests as being something that would help students test better, instead of accepting that this is some kind of natural event that happens? Where is it that standardized tests actually might have their part in helping prepare students to make those developmental leaps? And I thought that was very interesting, because I use tests as a teaching tool myself. So that really made sense to me. So I thought I would definitely include that. How far may we expect transfer of the recognition of second-order relations from one type of situation to another? So if we're testing a student, for example, in math and reading, which those are the two main core courses, so to speak, when we test them there, how much can we say, because they have mastered this, that they would be able to then transfer that ability to science without direct instruction, or to social studies, or to, pick another course, or even between reading and, English and math, as you'll see language arts and math, they do have something in common. So something of note in this study was pointed out that it has already been shown that the structure of verbal analogies is identical to that of numerical analogies, right? So if a student is testing really well in math but not so well in ELA, or vice versa, that really raises the question, if we know that the analogies are identical, what does that tell us about our instructional or testing methodology that we're not seeing that mirrored in the testing of our students? So I definitely included that, because that to me was a big question, because testing right now is really in the air of trying to figure out where our students are at post-pandemic, right? Have they lost any learning, or is there something to where they've kind of just checked out on us? Like, what's really going on? So I thought that was very, very interesting to include. Philip Nagy and Alan K. Griffiths had this to say. Again, this is another 40-something page piece, so I've included the resource there if you would like to read up on that. Group testing of intellectual development has enough problems, both empirical and theoretical, that its recent extensive use must be questioned, right? So I just came from a school where, to get data points, we did more testing, but we were doing so much testing, there was no time to take the data, refine the data, figure out what we needed to do with the data, come up with an action plan. It was just test, test, test. And it does question when you have students in class who are performing well. And this is something that we know now. Do our tests really measure how that person is developing intellectually? Because we say, quote unquote, not everybody does well on tests, and it doesn't mean they haven't learned. So that was a really good question that I think is really important for us right now, because testing seems to be the way we're trying to guide ourselves, and it's quick and it's easy when you're doing 150 students at a shot, say as a teacher load. But is there something better that we could be doing? And I thought that was a very, very good question. There's some work that they cite from Witz and Esley that suggests not only are group tests missing much of the fine details, so the individual's intellectual operations, but further that much may be missed with standard Paigean tasks when Paigean standard tasks are administered in an interview format. So what they're saying is not only do the standardized tests that we give maybe miss an individual's intellectual operations, and we're pretty aware of that, but in the interview format, we may miss even more. And I think that comes from my experience that when you read something, you may socially cue by your tone of voice, the tightening of your vocal cords, these little cues that we are able to pick up on. We might be leading a student, and so we're not necessarily measuring their individual intellectual operations development. So I thought that was interesting to include. So these are things where they're saying his work was valid, but these are things we need to consider as we go forward. If, as some evidence that they've cited suggests, the intellectual level at which an individual operates depends on particular subject matter, then it seems reasonable for the educational researchers to focus on the development of concepts and strategies within the domain of particular subject areas, rather than being concerned with identifying developmental levels in broader settings, or with investigating whether a stage of theory itself is correct. And I thought that was really important, and it kind of goes to what Lunzer was saying, is that if we know verbal analogies are identical to numerical analogies, but we can't predict if somebody is going to be able to transition that reasoning or those abilities to another area, then it really, as educators, it's most important for us to worry about our student and how they're doing in our class and developing their skills that we are specifically trained to do. So for me, that would be English language arts. And then those partnerships and collaborating to kind of meet the full student development. So I included that because of that, because I thought that was very, very important to kind of realize when we're looking at the development of a student. Well, we don't know 100% because it's a theory, and theories are not laws. We don't know how on the target Paiget was, but we know what we can do with his information. So I included that as well. So I've really gone over a little bit, and I apologize for that. This is going to be a really quick side-by-side of Erikson, Freud, and Paiget. So just to give some context, I won't go really deep into it. I've included the whole slide here, the next slide, that will cover all three of the theorists side by side, and you're welcome to come back to that. And I did include the link as well if you wanted to go and see it and take some more time to kind of compare those side by side, and that's there for you. And I'll just introduce it and then go ahead and wrap up because I'm at 23 minutes already. So here we have Erikson's 8 stages of man. So where Paiget has 4, Erikson fleshes it out a little bit further with 8 stages. So that's development towards maturity, and it's compared to Freud and Paiget. So for example, infancy, he breaks it down. Infancy is 1 to 1.5 years. Early childhood is 1 to 3 years. And so there's a little bit of overlap with the sensory motor. So he breaks it down, refines it a little bit more. He talks about the basic components. So I'm just going to do infancy and early childhood, and then I'll leave the rest for you to explore on your own. So for Erikson, he looks at developmental tasks to be achieved. So for infancy, 1 to 1.5 is trust versus mistrust. A sense of trust and security is derived from affection and gratification of needs. So developmental hazards would be neglect, abuse, deprivation of consistent and appropriate love in infancy, harsh or early weaning. And so when you look at that compared to the Paiget's cognitive stages, which is the sensory motor, so experiencing the world through the senses and actions, so looking, touching, mouthing, grasping, object permanence, and stranger anxiety, you can really see how the context of Erikson looking at the development towards maturity really could impact the cognitive stages, which is what Paget was looking at. And then Freud talks about the oral stages, so that's the psychosexual stages, the pleasure centers of the mouth, the sucking, the biting, and the chewing. And the psychosexual doesn't necessarily mean the way they take Freud to be something to where it's all sexualized. The psychosexual has to do with interacting with the world, and we have pleasure centers that don't have to do with sexuality. So, the sense of taste, the sense of smell, all of those things would really be at play. And again, if that's how you're learning and interacting with the world with the oral stage, you can see how that might affect with the sensory motor based on the infancy trust and mistrust. If you're neglected and you don't have like your needs met early on, each of these really does impact the Freud and the Erikson stages, does impact the cognitive stages of development. And the last one I'm going to do is early childhood, 1 to 3. So autonomy and versus shame and doubt. So a sense of autonomy, the child viewing himself as an individual in his own right. So that's the terrible twos, where they start to try to express their own will into the world, kind of pulling apart from the parents, saying that, the parents like, let's go to bed, and now the baby wants to fight about going to bed. And that's really, it's nothing personal. They're just starting to expressing that autonomy and their own, desires. So they're still dependent though. So conditions that would interfere with the child's achieving a feeling of adequacy or his learning skills such as walking would be developmental hazards. In Freud's psychosexual stages, the anal stage would be 18 to 36 months. So pleasure focuses on bladder and bladder elimination, coping with the demands and control. So there is something very pleasing for children as they, begin to master their own bodily functions. So, when they go to the bathroom and their little toilet, everybody praises them. And so that would build their sense of autonomy. It would, because then they can do it for themselves. They don't have to have their diaper changed, right? So you can kind of see how that would condition them to feel more autonomous and to have less shame and less doubt in the world. That would give them a sense of accomplishment. Again, that would go back to sensory motor, right? Those cognitive skills of their own awareness and control over themselves. And that's still in that egocentric. And so I'm going to leave it there because he goes into preschool, school age, adolescent, young adult, adulthood, and mature adulthood. And where I find is very, very interesting to me for the areas that I teach, it would be the adolescent and young adult, because those are the two areas where I work the most. And I found looking at Piaget, Freud, and Erikson all together really kind of gave a nice full picture of the child's development over time into young adulthood. So I really went over. I think I doubled the time, so apologies for that. Thank you for listening if you listened all the way through. I just really found it so interesting to look at Piaget, and I think I'm pronouncing his name right. I think I pronounced it 4 different ways throughout the presentation. But I really enjoyed learning a lot about what he was thinking, and then looking at people who have had some criticism, and it's constructive criticism, and then thinking, how can I apply this to my own work as a teacher, but also my own research. I'm a PhD student as well, looking at language development into the world of video games. So I found all of this super telling and super important. I hope you've enjoyed this little journey with me. My next slide will have the resources there for you, and you are welcome to look at them if you have any questions or want to know any further research that I might be able to point you towards. Please just reach out, and I will be more than happy to give you some to point you in the right direction. I know you can get from JSTOR, you can get a free account that'll let you read up to, I think it's 100 articles a month. I believe it's 100 articles a month. So please, take advantage of that because that's totally new. They didn't do that before the pandemic. So go ahead and sign up for that. All right, everyone, thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to reading everybody else's research. I made sure I didn't look at your research before I did mine and my presentation. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what you found as well.